Here's a provocative idea. What if there is no housing crisis, but rather that the market is working just as intended to make the rich richer and the working class beholden? That is the controversial thesis at the heart of Ricardo Tranjan's new book. It's called The Tenant Class. Ricardo Tranjan is a senior researcher with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and he joins us now here in studio. Hi there.
Hello.
Okay, you make the case that Canada doesn't have a housing crisis. Rather, the housing market is working exactly as intended. What does that mean?
When we talk about a crisis, we'd expect something that is a shock and that is surprising. We'd expect something that impacts everyone negatively, or most people, like COVID. Would expect everyone to be interested in solving that problem once and for all, because we don't like crisis. And nothing could be farthest from the truth when we're talking about housing in this country. It has been the same structure for the housing market and for the rental market specific for a very long time. The situation has been slowly deteriorating, but for a long time. It is not everyone that is living the negative impacts of it. It is tenants and people who are unhoused. Everyone else, they're doing quite fine. And also, in this part that I find most important, not everyone is interested in changing the status quo because some are benefiting tremendously from it.
Well, let me just understand. You think the decision makers have the system the way it is because they want to keep landlords up and tenants down?
They respond to the balance of forces and power in our society. And in our society, the real estate industry, developers, landlords, they have a lot more power to influence our policies than does the tenant class.
Okay, let's do an excerpt from your book. Sheldon, if you would, bring this up. This is from The Tenant Class, in which Ricardo writes, Canada's rental housing market is doing what rental markets do: extract income from working class families and transfer it to the capital-owning class. Landlords grow wealthy while tenant families experience financial insecurity, just like greedy bosses enrich on the backs of low-wage workers. The dominant housing crisis narrative is part of the problem. It exempts landlords and governments from responsibility by suggesting that excessive rents are a new and unexpected problem that requires complex technical solutions. While the experts look for those solutions, the market continues to do its thing. Okay, what is the dominant housing narrative you refer to there that you are trying to dismantle in this book?
The book tries to challenge the facile idea that supply and demand can explain everything we see in the housing market. That if we add more supply, prices will stabilize. If we add more people, prices will go up. That is only part of the story. And we know this. We have known this for a very long time.
What's the other part of the story?
The other part of the story is that supply is necessary but not sufficient. What we build, where we build, how we finance it, on whose land we build, whether we have regulations or not. That part of the story is equally important if your desired outcome is affordability. But when you get to those sets of questions, it's not simply about building. Now you get into very political questions about regulation, financing, and so on. And so that's the part of the conversation that we prefer. I like having it. I wrote the book so we can have it. But certain actors, namely developers, real estate investment trusts, and the real estate industry generally prefers not to have.
The book is called The Tenant Class. Is the tenant class everyone who's a tenant?
Yes. In my definition in the book, yes. Everyone who's a tenant, everyone who is also unhoused and who like to be a tenant, but unfortunately haven't managed to do so.
And what are some of, in your view, the myths that people believe about the tenant class?
Yes, with the book, when you kind of get out of the new classical economics and starts going into political economy, you inevitably bump into some of the cultural aspects of our system as a whole. And it was impossible not to talk about the myths and the notion that tenants are overall people who failed, essentially. If you work hard, the myth goes, and you save, you will be able to buy a house and you no longer be a tenant. That is not true. People remain tenants for a number of reasons, and they're not simply second-class rates. They also deserve to have political rights. And this conversation is important, I think, the myth conversation, is because while the middle class is constantly aspiring for home ownership, that's where politicians will go too, because they know how to read the room, and it becomes harder to talk about renter issues.
You write that landlords are sometimes mischaracterized as sort of struggling family mom-and-pop operations. What is not accurate about that?
It's two things. First, One is that small popular landlord, mom and pop landlord, it's only a share of the market, right? And in the book, I estimate that is about 22% would be small business owners, and there's another 30% or so would be investors. They are a share of the market, they're not all of it. The second problem is that we tend to talk about them as struggling families, not as investors. So in the book, I pick an excerpt from a news article that describes a family that decided to buy a second home to make capital gains and
have a source of income.
Have a second source of income. Things went south, and they had to sell it. But the entire story in the newspapers, and we see this often, is described as this one family is struggling, right? I rephrase that and I say, well, investors had some money set aside. They decided to go for something that is high returns and low risk, so they went into the real estate market. What happened is that business didn't go as well as they desired. They had some operational losses, but they still had capital gains that more than offset their operational losses. Why are we not talking about landlords in those terms? Why is this struggling family trying to pay their own mortgage? It mischaracterized the situation greatly.
You also write that the most direct and sure way for tenants to gain power is to organize and mobilize and fight back. And again, what is the end game of all of that?
The end game is for tenants to be recognized as a political class and to have the right to collective bargaining. Right now, tenants have the right to organize, but they don't have any mechanisms to exert those collective
So you want them
rights.
to be more like a labor union.
Exactly. And when you look at, as the book does, at 150 years of tenant organizing in Canada, it always starts in the very local, in these small rent strikes and other collective actions. But usually, moments where there is a strong tenant movement are followed by policy changes that have positive impacts for tenants, additional protections, additional government funding for no-market housing, all sorts of things, right? So in a historical perspective, the tenant movement has often been successful in improving the conditions for tenants.
If you look at the whole province of Ontario, though, there are more homeowners than tenants, right? And politicians tend to go where the votes are. And homeowners vote more in disproportionate numbers to tenants as well. So how is this road to victory ever going to happen, given those circumstances?
Yes. And that's the political work that the tenant class and organized tenants needs to do. And we've seen a number of cases where they have been successful. And I will provide you a very recent example. The Enough is Enough campaign that we have now in Ontario. We had some very large demonstrations recently. It seems like Labour and others have formed a united front against the Ford government. There are 5 demands. One of them is rent controls. If you think about the last 5 or 6 years, tenant issues has not been a forefront issue in the opposition against Doug Ford. But now it is one of the 5 asks in this new and seemingly large campaign. And I think that is not unrelated with the rent strikes we're seeing right now. It's not unrelated with the growth in tenant unions and the organizing that the book documents.
Let's finish up on this. You clearly have you've planted your flag with the tenant side of this argument. There is obviously the other side as well. If you demonize one side of this equation against another, how does that help us get closer to what needs to be done at the end of the day, which is a system that works for all?
Yes, I don't think I'm demonizing. I'm thinking I'm describing the reality and the day-to-day of rental market challenges. Actually, I would argue that when we do not take politics and power and social forces into account, when we pretend that this is all a technical issue, that we can bring folks like me into a room, that we think really hard and come up with a decision for it, that we will just solve all the problems. I think that that's politically naive to put so much hope in technical solutions when we live in a system that is political, where land, where housing is built, is the most political thing that we can think about.
So this is a battle, and you just feel the tenants need to win the battle.
Absolutely.
All right, we got it. Ricardo Tranjan is the author of The Tenant Class. He's also a political economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and we thank him for coming into TVO tonight.
Thank you for having me.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.